Today is part 2 of a 4-part preaching series reflecting on generational differences. Last week, Corinne preached about and to millennials. If you missed it, it's available on our website, on Facebook. I am a Gen Xer, born in 1970. Like Corinne, I can't claim to speak for my generation, but I will try to speak about it and perhaps to it.
Our scripture reading today comes from 1 Peter chapter 2. Rid yourselves, therefore, of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, "See, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. To you then who believe, he is precious. But for those who do not believe, the stone that builders rejected had become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the word, as they were destined to do."
May these words be to us our light and our life. Bueller. A nerdy teacher takes attendance in a passionless, monotone voice to a room full of bored teenagers. The camera focuses in on an empty desk where Ferris Bueller usually sits. Meanwhile, at home, Ferris, played by Matthew Broderick, is lying in bed while his parents feel his cold, clammy hands. They decide he should stay home. And as they both head off to work, Ferris says to them with a sappy smile, "It's nice to know I have such loving and caring parents. You know, you both are very special people." They both smile, full of pride, and leave for work, leaving Ferris alone for the day. The door closes, and Ferris sits upright and says to the camera, "They bought it." "Incredible," he says. "One of the worst performances of my career, and they never doubted it for a second." He goes on to explain the keys to faking out your parents, saying, you fake a stomach cramp, and then when you're bent over, moaning and groaning, you lick your palms. It's a little childish and stupid, but then so is high school. He and his friends spend the rest of the day having adventures in and around Chicago. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a favorite movie among Generation X, those born between 1965 and 1980-ish. And it captures perhaps so much of what people think define us. Generation X is wedged between two much larger generations, baby boomers on one side and millennials on the other. They've tried to give us other names: the MTV generation, latchkey kids, the lost generation, and slackers. But nothing really stuck until 1991, when Douglas Copeland's novel came out, Generation X: Tales for an Accelerated Culture. X is used as a variable to represent the unknown. It is perhaps a perfect name for a generation that resists being defined, especially defined by adults. and sees everything as relative and up for debate. Though generalizing about any generation might be foolish, even dangerous, we can talk about the world in which we, Generation X, were born and came of age. Generation X was born in the wake of so many social changes and the idealism of the 1960s, but also its fallout and backlash in the 1970s and 1980s. We are the first generation after the approval of the birth control pill and the legalization of abortion, both directly contributing to why our generation is smaller. But we also saw the rise of the moral majority under Jerry Falwell and the mobilization of conservative Christians to elect Ronald Reagan. As feminism liberated women to join the work world, traditional gender roles shifted. Divorce rates rose, doubling between 1965 and 1980's peak of 52%. My parents divorced when I was 10. Working parents often left their children home alone, unsupervised, particularly after school. The sexual revolution and the Stonewall Uprising opened the closet for gay liberation. Then in 1979, Harvey Milk was assassinated. And by the mid-1980s, AIDS began to devastate the gay community, until AIDS became the leading cause of death for all 25 to 44-year-olds in the United States the year I turned 25. We were born during the space race, which took our imaginations to the moon and beyond. We met Vulcans, stormtroopers, and a computer killer named Hal. But our space dreams came to a crashing halt when the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up. I can still hear their last words, "Go" at throttle up. We saw the end of the Vietnam War, the Watergate break-in, and the Iran-Contra affair, all fueling mistrust and skepticism of government. The hope and promise of racial equality became blurred by the war on drugs in the 1970s, the crack epidemic of the 1980s, and the beating of Rodney King in 1991. Now, according to my Facebook survey last week of my other Gen X friends, our other influences include MTV, Sesame Street, Love Boat, Michael J. Fox, Michael Jordan, and Michael Jackson, Saturday morning cartoons, Dungeons and Dragons, the Rubik's Cube, Evel Knievel, Hulk Hogan, Top Ramen, and tops on everyone's list, personal computers. When I was a kid, my dad brought home the punch cards from the U's large computers that took up a whole room. In 4th grade, I played Oregon Trail on an Apple II computer in the computer room at my school. And in college, a friend leaned over in the computer lab and told me he had received something called an email from someone at another school. Technology and connectivity, more than almost anything, has shaped our generation. Some of the words that have been used to try and describe Generation X were individualistic, apathetic, realistic, independent, practical, nihilistic, technologically adept, ready for adventure, but disaffected. But I urge you not to try to apply any of these to an actual Gen Xer. We resist labels. We embraced outsider status. Is there any wonder why we, after catching the fallout from so much social and political upheaval, would reject the adult world, pull into ourselves, and look for ways to escape through music, through television, and through video games. The 1983 movie War Games is another movie where school is pointless, adults are clueless, and teenagers must take on the moral challenges of society. Things start in a biology classroom where, again, Matthew Broderick arrives late. His teacher hands him a test where there's a big fat F on it, but Broderick's character, David, is not worried in the least. After being sent to the office for an attitude adjustment, he sneaks a peek at the school's network password, and later at home, turns on his computer, takes his old school phone and puts it in the modem cradle, dials in to the school computer, and changes his grade to an A. Later, his computer skills get him in trouble as he uses them to accidentally hack into NORAD's War Games supercomputer, which sets in motion a very real series of events that brings the country to the doorstep of World War III. Knowing that he may cause the end of the world, David says what many of us thought in those days: I wish I didn't know about any of this. I wish it was like everybody else in the world, and tomorrow it would just be over. There wouldn't be any time to be sorry about anything. War and the threat of war has shortened the childhoods of many generations. Knowing that we might have less than 20 minutes warning of a nuclear attack, I remember distinctly as a 12-year-old mapping out my plan for what I would do for the last minutes of my life. And I think I was probably a little more hopeful than the average Gen Xer. It took a long time, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, glasnost, the dismantling of the Iron Curtain, for this hyper-vigilance to subside. I have to admit, since November 9th, it has suddenly returned. So hearing all of this, is it any wonder that Gen Xers tend to reject a belief in modernism, that progress, reason, democracy, and technology can alone perfect the world? Is it any wonder that Gen Xers have left the church in droves, finding its platitudes and heavenly gaze largely irrelevant to the complex world we've experienced? While millennials are a large part of the growing group of nuns, those who claim no religious affiliation, many Gen Xers are perhaps best described as the duns, those who were raised in the church but are now done with religion. And so we come to our scripture reading for today. Now, anyone who's lived a little could easily just roll their eyes at this reading. Rid yourselves, therefore, of all guile and insincerity. Why rid ourselves of the resourcefulness and cynicism that has kept us sane through all this turmoil? Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation. Look, we've seen too much to go back to naivete and dependency. Whatever the pure spirit milk is, I can brew my own, thank you. It might be cool to roll our eyes at these images, but this is not insider language. First, Peter is speaking to folks who themselves felt like outsiders, people of spiritual curiosity, but who felt outside still of the household of God as Gentiles. The writer then calls Jesus the living stone, rejected by the world, yet chosen and precious in God's light. Now, we might relate to this rejected Jesus. He is not an overhyped product of a mind-numbing, scarcity-driven market economy. He spoke from the margins, with those left out and left behind by so-called progress. He called the powers and principalities to account for their absence, their greed, their self-serving short-sightedness. He called the community into accountability for one another, a deeper relationship than they had known or even thought possible. His vision left no one out. It was radical but tangible, idealistic but practical, holy and yet embodied. He gave his life for this vision, and the world did reject him. But this rejection is not the end of the story. And this is good news for Generation X. Now, before Dwayne Johnson, Peter was the rock upon which Jesus chose to found the church. But even Peter rejected Jesus 3 times. Today's passage quotes Psalm 118, reminding us that the stone that the builders rejected becomes the cornerstone. That is the cornerstone of a new beginning for God's people. Peter calls Jesus a living stone. Salvation does not negate the bitterness of rejection, but integrates it, transforms it, builds upon it. And this is good news for everyone in the Breakfast Club. Anyone who has felt like an outsider, anyone who's been labeled or misunderstood or cast aside. The stones of our past selves are not just dead weight, but living stones upon which God is trying to build something. Come, Peter says, come like living stones and let yourselves be built into a spiritual house. I remember when I used to live in Minnesota before, that Cool 108 was the oldies station. Now it plays music from the 1980s and calls them greatest hits. I think that is very kind marketing. Gen Xers are now 35 to 55 years old. As adults, they have proven themselves to be entrepreneurs, hardworking, and have a better work-life balance than their parents. They are ascending into leadership positions, and now themselves are parents. A 2016 Huffington Post article sums up Gen X parenting this way. We had our kids late, probably too late. Now we're cranky, sleep-deprived 40-somethings clinging and changing chlorine-free, biodegradable diapers, while Dora the Explorer morphs into a hormonal teen right before our eyes. We cart our children to chess and robotics and baseball practice and ballet and cello and swimming lessons and birthday parties. And though they run our lives like lunatic ringmasters, we insist such activities make them well-rounded, social, intellectual, competitive, creative. And our children are rarely out of our sights. Having children is a tremendous act of hope. I'm not sure we were conscious of that. We just thought it'd be fun to have kids. But now that I'm actually watching them become people, I'm asking myself, how do I prepare them for the complexities that they will face? It certainly will require more than sharing my Legos and Star Wars action figure collection with them. But we are building a world my children will inherit. And our actions will figure prominently in their eyes. I think they will need Gen X's resilience and our willingness to face reality, but they will also need hope. And this will require all of us to move past the epidemic of cynicism in our society. We must rid ourselves, yes, of some of the guile and insecurity, some of the insincerity, not to become naive, but to become useful in the work of building a safe, welcoming, just, and peaceful spiritual house for generations to come. Being a slacker is just another form of resistance. Today, surely we need all forms of resistance to focus outwardly on moving us away from the precipice of disaster on which we once again find ourselves.